kia ora tātou. Tuatahira kai te mihi ki te nuna rawa ki hai ki nā kupu kōrero. I te tīmatana kupu ko te atua te kupu. Ko te atua anō te tīmatana me te whakaotina o nā mea kato. Nō reira kia whai kororia ki tōna inu. Ti hei uri te hei nako ka tauha ki te rangi e tū i hone ka tauha i te papa e tako toa kene. Ka tauha te matuku mai raro tona ko ia i ruku hia manawa pau roto ko ia i ruku hia manawa pau aho. Whakatīnā ki a tīnā te more i Hawaii ki e pupu ana hoki e wawau ana hoki. Tāre watu ki te rangi aua eke panuku haumi e hui e tai ki e. O tirai te whakaritira ki te ahuatana ki o tātou mate. Kia rātau nei rā ko huri atu ki tua te arai. Nā tōtara hae mata, nā manu ti ori o runai nā waka, nā kakatara hae o runai nā marae. Ko rātau nei rā kua mene atu ki te pō, haere atu rā koutou ki te pūtahitana o rehua, aha kua tipua te o tau, kua tipua te māheu, ko koutou tonu rāwe nei e mihi tia nei. Nō reira haere atu rā koutou ki Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao, a ki te hui nā te kahurani, kaotia tua i koutou. Nō reira tau ārai ki te pō koutou ki a koutou, tītoko ki te ao mārama tātou te hunaora e tau nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. A tēnā rā koutou i hara mai nei tawhiti. I hara mai tata. I hara mai nei runake nei, mai tā wāhi. Kia te mai e rākina ki tēnei hui nā koutou. Nō reira tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou kua te mai nei. Nō reira nau mai hara mai ki te whenua o nai tahu Ngāti Māmo e Waitaha. Ko rātau nei rā te mana whenua o tēnei takiwā. Tēnua mai rā ki te whare tuaki nei tāne whakapiripiri. Anei rā te whare wānana o tāka e mihi atu nei kia koutou. Nō reira nau mai hara mai. Hara mai reiru nei te karana, a hara mai reiru nei te pōhiri, a hara mai reiru nei te kaupapa kai te whakarita e koutou i tēnei rā. Nō reira ka reku mea roa hia te kōrero ko te mea nui ke, te whakatau i a koutou kua tai mai nei. Nō reira huri nei roto i tō tātou whare, e nā mana, e nā reo, e nā kārana rana katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. No reira, kia rono, that's the formal part gone now. At this point now, I'm going to have a prayer for you fellas from today till you fellas finish tomorrow. So let us pray. E hua te matua te tama te wairua tapua nei tā puro nei tuatu nei ki mai tōu waru te tuku whakamoi mi te whakawhetai atu kia koe mo tēnei hui nā mātau i tēnei rā. No reira kai te inui kai te tani atu kia koe kia tau mai rā tā manaki kuna kia mātau katoa. Anei rā ki e tahi o mātau hara mai nei tawhiti mai tata e tō mātau atua kia tau mai ki tēnei hui. Nō reira kai te inua kai te tani atu kia koe kia ara ia mai mātau koe roto i a mātau kaupapa kōrero. Kia haere tonu koe ki wāninu i a mātau kia tapatahia i o mātau nā kau kia koe. E te atua nā mano e noho nei te rangi ko koe tō mātau he pora e kure hapa. Ko koe anohai whakahokia ki o mātau wairua e arahi nei a mātau ki nā ara o te tika. E whakaaro hoki nāku tō inua te atua tohu ni a mātau ki arite ki tōu atawhai. Te tini au aro atana te muru nā mātau hara. E te atua whakarono ki tā mātau karana. Tahuri mai au tarina ki a mātau i noi. Hai pirina koe mō mātau, hai pākahai o mātau huariri katoa. Proria ki tō inua tapu. Amen.
Kia ora, ngā mihi hata. Ko Sean toku ingoa. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of myself and Michael Jack, the co-conveners of the Otago Energy Research Center. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, and nō mai haere mai. My pen's going to fall away. We've got a really rich and diverse program that we'll run through over the next couple of days. And I guess we'll just start off with some basic housekeeping, just so people are aware. We've got the toilets that are out here and over on this side. And if there's any kind of emergency or anything, we can just go out any of the doors that way and gather out on the lawn in the rain out there. Before we get started, this is our 17th annual OERC Research Symposium. And of course, that wouldn't be possible with a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. So I want to say a few thanks at the start, just in case we forget towards the end. But I want to thank our steering committee with OERC and the support that they provided throughout the year to make this event happen. We've got lots of student volunteers that are supporting technology and making sure that things are running well. And of course, Jared, who pulls all the strings behind the scenes and makes sure that things are well organized. So today we will largely focus on energy well-being, and that's linked to the Energy Wellbeing Consortium and the work that's been going on there. And then we'll shift into more sort of broad and diverse look at energy across sort of regional transitions and different energy technologies and innovations and that kind of thing later on this afternoon and tomorrow. Just a reminder that we do have people attending in person and online, and like us to try and make our online colleagues feel welcome. And there's one of the few things that we can do to make that a more enjoyable experience for them is to make sure that we use the microphone when we're asking any questions so that they can hear what those questions are, and make sure that we're engaging and interacting with them as the day proceeds. What else? I think that's really it in terms of welcome. Hope you enjoy the conference. I think we've put together a really interesting program over the next couple of days. Before we shift into the keynote, I do want to acknowledge the work and to thank Anna Burka, who's helped from Massey University. She's helped to organize the energy well-being sessions, and unfortunately she's unable to be here today, and I don't think was able to join us online either, but just wanted to acknowledge her work in doing that. All right, I'm going to shift now to our keynote speaker. Ian, make sure you're online there.
I am indeed. Yeah. Hi.
Great. Thanks for joining us in the evening in the UK. So Ian's the Director of Development and Communication at the Centre for Sustainable Energy in the UK. And he'll be talking to us about a sustainable transition and the implications or understanding the distributional impacts of energy policy. And so Ian is really ideally an ideal person to kick off our symposium. He's has worked for many years in the energy modeling, data analysis, with a particular focus on the distributional and equity impacts of a number of different UK energy policies. And I think in addition to that work, he is also very much committed to understanding and communicating the practical on-the-ground implications of energy policies for energy consumers, and has run a number of energy advice projects in the UK. So we are really fortunate to have Ian to kick off our symposium, and our focus this morning on energy well-being evaluation. So please join me in welcoming Ian to our symposium.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your kind words. I'm going to try, the first challenge obviously is to share my slides. So hopefully this is going to work. And if I can find my, well, let's see if I press F5. Might. For some reason, right, I'm going to unshare and start again. Hang on. Not doing very well here. This worked fine a minute ago, didn't it?
Yeah.
Here we go. Here we go. Great. Okay, I've managed to find the cursor. The mouse cursor disappeared. So apologies. So thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to start off by, first of all, introducing the Centre for Sustainable Energy, because you guys won't know, you don't know who we are, or you might have heard of us, I don't know. So we were formed in 1979 when four chaps from Bristol went to the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth in Wales, which is their 50 this year. So they were formed in 1973. It was a demonstration space for kind of new technologies, renewables. And they came back to Bristol and they thought that was very inspiring, and they wanted to do something in an urban setting. So they set up the Urban Centre for Appropriate Technology. And then in 1988, we were called Bristol Energy Centre. We ran a bunch of energy efficiency programs using the ESCO model. So that's a model where you kind of regain the payment from the savings from those measures. Unfortunately, Bristol Energy Centre very, very nearly went to the wall and went bankrupt almost, but not quite. In 1998, the Centre for Sustainable Energy we were renamed as that. And then we've had some rebranding exercises. I've hopefully got a little video that I can play you. We created this when we won the Ashton Award for fuel poverty. Ashton are a trust who give awards. They give an international award for sort of work on climate and energy justice, but they have a national award which we won. So I'll play this. Hopefully this works.
There's no sound there coming through.
No sound.
Yeah, sorry, it doesn't look like the sound's coming through.
Have you got any sound?
No, there's no sound. I think there's probably an issue with the complicated technology we have at our end.
Okay, that's fine. I can I can talk to it anyway. So let me just close that and then hopefully move on to the next slide. Okay, I'll move on from that slide and I'll tell you about CSE instead. So we're interesting in that we're quite unique for the UK. There are other NGOs, charities who do research work in the energy space, like we do, but there are no other organisations like CSE that have 3 different teams that work separately but complement each other. So we have a research and analysis team who do a bunch of kind of sort of policy analysis. We develop tools, so we do heat network modelling for the UK government. We also do spatial planning. We also have a communities team who support community energy groups to develop projects, help look at funding models for community scale renewables. We work with planning authorities around kind of local planning policies. And we also have a household energy services team that run energy efficiency programs. You could probably see from the video someone going into someone's house. So we have these 3 different teams doing very different but complementary work. So I joined CSE in 2001. I was in the research team for 13 years. I then was the lead for the team that run all the energy efficiency programs and advice work. And now I'm leading the fundraising and communications. This is our organizational strategy. So we're a dual focused charity in terms of our mission. We're here to end the misery of cold homes, but also tackle climate change. And our organizational strategy is split into these five objectives. No one suffers a cold home. Everyone's empowered to take action on energy. All homes are low carbon and livable, so that's about retrofitting homes. Places are shaped for sustainable energy and a greener and smarter, fairer energy system that works for all. So I'm in this kind of presentation, what I wanted to try and do is talk to you about some of the work CSE has done, some of the research we've done, some of the data sets we've used, but also kind of set the scene for some of the changes in energy policy and some of the global events that actually led to those things happening. So thinking about fuel poverty to begin with and where it came from. So I spoke to Brenda Boardman, Dr. Brenda Boardman, before giving this presentation and wanted a bit of background on fuel poverty. And she sort of reminded me that actually the concept of fuel poverty was driven by the Yom Kippur War in 1973 between several Arab states and Israel. So quite pertinent to the kind of current geopolitical situation. So following that war, oil prices effectively increased 4-fold. So that's why, you know, in 1976, that's why we had these, you know, these chaps from Bristol thinking about going to CAT, you know, because fuel prices had gone up and people could see that there was a need to kind of address energy use and find a more sustainable way to live. So at the time, the government at the time was quite opposed to this idea of fuel poverty. And in 1975, the National Right to Fuel campaign was founded. It was quite a cold winter in 76. And there was lots of kind of press coverage, but also the government produced a number of reports saying that fuel poverty was a pricing issue, which led to a voluntary code for gas and electricity supply at the time. Back in the 1970s in the UK, there were no energy efficiency policies. The government didn't really understand much about energy use. There was some research by Isherwood and Hancock that found 18% of households spent twice the medium amount on fuel. So that at the time was considered to be sort of severe fuel poverty. So Brenda Boardman did her doctorate in the 80s, and she then came up with the kind of figures that the original 10% definition was based on. So she looked at something at the time which was called the Expenditure and Food Survey, and that's how she identified the spend, and she found out that 30% of the households on the lowest income spent 10% of their weekly income on fuel, and the other 70%, the average was 5.1%. So her reasoning was 10% is double the norm, and that's where the original kind of 10% definition came from. But in terms of translating this kind of research on fuel poverty, and also in the climate of increased fuel costs into an actual change in policy, it was a battle that was hard fought at the time. So there's a couple of quotes here, and these are from Brenda's book. You can see in 1985, the Secretary of State is pretty clear that, you know, fuel poverty is not a thing that the government believes exists. Following, Brenda's doctorate and further research, by the academic community, there was a shift in mindset, and by 1998 you can see that the government saying we need a strategy to address the problem. So that was kind of put down into statute in the UK kind of law, and we had this definition that a person's regarded as fuel poverty if they can't keep their house warm at reasonable cost, and it was measured using this 10% definition. As all things in kind of research, I guess we weren't necessarily that happy with that definition. At the time, the government reported on 4 different measures actually in the using the English Housing Survey. That was the survey that they then used to measure fuel poverty. Full cost, basic cost, after housing costs, and residual income. The figure that the government used, the 10% definition, used a definition of full income. So for a long time, many others kind of working in the fuel poverty policy space argued that full income wasn't the best definition. You should be using a kind of an income poverty term, which is after housing costs, because you can't spend money that you need to spend on your housing on fuel, and also that should be equivalized to account for the size of household. But the government didn't do that at the time. It used full income, but we'll come back to that because the definition of fuel poverty did change as time went on. So I'm going to talk now about some work that CSE did back in 2002, 2003, which really sort of helped move things forward from a kind of policy perspective, but also that's from a kind of a delivery, sort of turning policy into practice. Because obviously it was great that we had this definition of fuel poverty, but we needed to understand where the people in fuel poverty were, and then how we could identify them. Otherwise, how do you then tackle the problem? So what we did is we worked with the University of Bristol. We had a project that was funded by SWEB, which stood for South West Electricity Board, which that was pre-privatisation of the energy sector in the UK. So SWEB now would be, I guess, what is called EDF in terms of the supplier that sort of took over SWEB. What we did is we produced a small area indicator of fuel poverty, and we did that for the then energy supplier so that they could target their energy efficiency programs. At the time, it was something called the Energy Efficiency Commitment. We originally did that with the 1991 census and the 1996 English Housing Condition Survey. And we did that at something called ward level. So a ward in England is like it's a sort of political area. It's generally an area which defines where a local council would stand. And it probably has at least 1,000 or more houses in it. It's quite a reasonably large area. We redid this work in 2001 when the census changed and had something called output areas in and low super output areas. So I'm just realizing that you might not know what the census is either. So the census is something that's been running in the England for a very long time, and it's a large survey of the whole UK population. Everyone gets sent kind of a thing to fill in, a questionnaire. It became famous at one point because Jedi became a recognised religion in the UK, because there was a kind of thing going around that when you got your census paper, you could say that your religion was Jedi. So it's a thing now in the census that comes back. There's a genuine number of Jedis in the UK as a result of the census. Anyway, in 1991, it was a ward level, and then at 2001, they redid the census and they created output areas. This was a new geographical area which they published the boundaries for, which was much smaller. So output areas have like around 100 houses in, and lower super output areas about 600 houses. So what we did is we worked with the University of Bristol, and in both occasions we took the English Housing Survey, which is a representative sample of housing, but it has very detailed information about property characteristics, and also from that you can calculate the energy demand. And we used multivariate sort of regression analysis to give weightings, which were then applied to the sort of the spatial level. So we did that in 1996 using ward level data, but then we redid it in sort of 2001 at lower super output area level. And you've got a map there which shows fuel poverty in a place called Cornwall, with red being the kind of worst areas and green being where fuel poverty is least. This at the time was kind of quite groundbreaking. Obviously nobody had done that before. Effectively now the government produces this data set every single year. If you were to search for sub-regional fuel poverty statistics on gov.uk, you will get to the fuel poverty statistics page. So and that's still a data set that's routinely been made available, because it's become kind of part of policy. Not only part of policy, it's also become a useful political tool. So you can use the small area statistics on fuel poverty, you can add up those low super output areas, and then you can get a figure for fuel poverty in a local authority area. So for example, on that map, there's North Cornwall, that's a local authority area. You can work out the total number of fuel poverty. And similarly with a political boundary constituency, you can do the same. And effectively, when we have Prime Minister's questions here in the UK, at PMQs, if somebody asks how many people are in fuel poverty in a particular area, they use these statistics. So not only have they been kind of useful from a kind of delivery perspective when we want to target energy efficiency programs at an area, they've kind of also become kind of part of the fabric. But I did mention earlier that fuel poverty changed in the UK, and that all came about in about 2011. And at the time, I didn't really understand why the government decided to redefine fuel poverty. I mean, I think partly it was because the figures were going up so much because energy prices had gone up. Fuel poverty was almost at 5 million at the time. So this is in 2010, 2011. And I guess that's an unacceptable figure. But so what I had a side conversation with a civil servant several years later, and they said one of the reasons that fuel poverty was reviewed was because the Financial Times ran an article saying that the Queen was in fuel poverty. So some bright spark at a newspaper had worked out the Queen's income relative to her entire estate, which is quite big. And then worked out that she must spend 10% of her income on her fuel cost. And several kind of MPs and ministers had felt that this was, kind of ridiculous. But also I think it was partly the pressure of fuel poverty stats going up and up and up, and therefore,
so
the gap.
The German views that we got was good.
The gap between the rich and poor not being as great as we thought. So they brought in a very credible academic, Professor John Hills, from the London School of, I'm going to say medicine hygiene. Case was the London School of Economics, sorry. And he led the review with a bunch of civil servants. And in that review, they wanted to look at the existing 10% definition and see how good it was against a kind of bunch of key indicators, really. So can you monitor trends with it and detect underlying sort of changes? Can you identify the kinds of people who are affected? Can you design policy around it? Can you also look at the extent and the depth of fuel poverty and possibly persistence. You know, with the 10% definition, they felt it was very much like you're in fuel poverty or you're not. There wasn't a kind of a measure of how deep your fuel poverty was. So fuel poverty, the 10% definition was it was basically driven by three factors: your income, how energy efficient your property was, and fuel prices. That's what it was sensitive to. But as shown by this kind of chart where fuel poverty was going up to sort of 5-6 million, and the press were talking about the Queen being in fuel poverty, it was extremely sensitive to fuel prices. And you know, the government felt that was a problem, and that it was meaning that they couldn't target policy effectively because fuel poverty had become like a third of the population, or you know, it was reaching a point where it was no longer a useful measure. So in the Hills review, they looked at a number of options. They looked at some minor adjustments to the definition. So taking housing costs out of the income, which is what everyone said they should do anyway. Increasing that threshold from 10%, looking at a sort of fuel poverty gap. And then there were some more fundamental changes, which I sort of come on to. In the end, they sort of picked this option E. And I think you can see why when I show you the next chart, really. So they modelled all of these. There's the current definition. We'd had 1996, 5 million people in fuel poverty, and then the points of the green bars are where the English Housing Survey ran. It became a yearly survey from sort of 2003 onwards. Before that, it was every 2 or 3 years. And you can see, basically, fuel poverty is going down. The government was doing well, and then it went up. And actually, by 2011, it was back up at 5 million. And that was a big reason for the redefinition, I feel. So they looked at these after housing costs, twice the median, which would have, you know, made it higher. And then they came up with this low income, low relative SAP. So a little description there. I'll move on. So the definition they decided on in the Hills review was low income with high energy cost, and included a fuel poverty gap. And they all felt this was incredibly good. We did a huge piece of work looking at the definition alongside the government redefining it. We as a group of kind of charities and NGOs managed to get some funding, and 3 fairly large organisations worked together to sort of in a parallel process of trying to do the same thing. And then we spoke to the civil servants about our ideas and things that they came up with, which was a useful process, and they were quite open to dialogue. But if you are thinking about trying to get yourself a measure of energy poverty or fuel poverty in New Zealand, don't necessarily reproduce this, and I'll sort of explain why in a minute, because it was a bit flawed fundamentally. So the concept they came up with was effectively, to be in fuel poverty, you need to be in the quadrant on the sort of bottom left of the square. So you have an income threshold, you've got the income line, the sort of, I forget which way the X is, I think that's the X-axis, the sort of vertical. So you have to be in income poverty. So that's after housing cost and the income's equivalised. So we like that. And then your energy cost has to be above the median for everybody. So they looked at the English Housing Survey and they worked out what the median required fuel spend was. So the English Housing Survey is not a measure of your energy consumption. It's a measure of your energy requirements. So they take all of the characteristics about the property in the English Housing Survey, and then they run that through a calculator called SAP, which is Standard Assessment Procedure, which is derivative of an energy model called BREEDM. They use that to calculate your energy bill. So they took the median of everybody and they said to be in fuel poverty, you have to be low income, high cost. You have to be in this quadrant in the bottom. And then the income line is sort of slanted because they kind of adjusted that income to account for everybody's own fuel bill. They kind of, which makes the line slant. And then you've got these households here, A and B, are in fuel poverty. And the gap is how much your fuel bill would need to reduce to get you to the line so that you're no longer in that kind of quadrant. And they like that because they had as kind of a measure of fuel poverty, either you're in, you're out, but then also this kind of defined need to get someone out of fuel poverty. So I've just, there's a summary of really what I've just said, to be honest, in terms of after income, after housing cost, the lines adjusted for model bills and how the cost threshold was calculated. So I guess the problem that you have with this kind of this definition, which is based on effectively a median for your energy bill, but also, I mean, income poverty is sort of 6% of the median itself. So these are two things based on kind of median values. The problem you've got is those fuel poor households. If you insulate those homes, great, they move out of that box, but then you're going to have to recalculate your median because you've moved a bunch of households out of it, so their energy bills are different. So then what you find is the line shifts and those households come back into fuel poverty. So, well, some do, some new ones do, some of the old ones do. So they created a kind of a situation where you can never solve fuel poverty. Even if you insulate everybody, if you improve all the households, that median line is always going to move to a point where you've got people in fuel poverty. You effectively cannot solve fuel poverty. So whilst they've created a better measure in their mind, and it probably was, in that the income was equivalized and after housing cost, it became unworkable. And also, I've gone through that quite quickly. This is a kind of a research symposium, so you are all kind of numerate, and I'm sure you can get your head around the concept that I've just explained, but trying to explain that to somebody who's calling you up from the Times or the Telegraph, which at the time I had to, people from newspapers were ringing me up saying, can you explain this new definition of fuel poverty? It's just impossible. So they then reviewed that a couple of years later, and they actually adopted a measure which we'd recommended at the time, and it became the low income, low energy efficiency rating, low efficiency being defined by SAP. So under the new rating, instead of having a median, it's based on an energy efficiency rating. So energy efficiency rating of, say, band C. And if you make that person's home more efficient than that, if they become like EPC A, B, and C, then they're no longer in fuel poverty because they're above the line. So just to clarify what EPC is, as I mentioned earlier, we've got an energy model in the UK called BREEDM, which stands for, I think, Building Research Establishment Domestic Energy Model. And there is a sort of a cut down version of that, which has like kind of less formulas, which is called SAP, Standard Assessment Procedure. And it's that algorithm that is used to calculate how efficient properties are in the UK. And they are now presented on something called EPCs, Energy Performance Certificates. EPCs were introduced into UK policy as a result of some European legislation. There was a European Buildings Directive that said all buildings in Europe had to have an energy efficiency rating, both domestic and non-domestic. SAP is the thing that we used, and if you sell a house in the UK, you have to get an EPC so that the person buying it can see the rating. but also if you rent a house, your landlord has to get one as well. So fuel poverty now is about being in income poverty, but also having a property which is basically at the bottom of this graph. And that has fundamentally kind of altered UK energy policy design. Since 2017, EPC ratings are like, they're a component now of whether you're eligible. So you're no longer eligible for grant support, for insulation, all of those sorts of measures, unless your EPC rating is E, F or G. There's sometimes some leniency around Ds, but the idea is the way policy is now designed, we talk about doing the worst first, the worst being the properties that have an EPC of E, F or G. During COVID, there was a sort of a whole bunch of new grant programs launched to help with green recovery, and they are all completely focused on energy efficiency, poor energy efficiency properties, as well as the tariff measures such as warm homes discount, which are also focused on efficiency. So I'm going to say a little bit about some of the work now that we've done on carbon emissions, because I've talked about fuel poverty. And I think our work on sort of fairness around kind of the distribution of energy and emissions really was kickstarted in 2006 when Ed Miliband, who got the environment brief in the sort of cabinet reshuffle, gave us a speech, and he effectively said in that speech at a minor event that they were going to look at personal carbon allowances. So CSE went on to do that. We did a study looking at personal carbon allowances for labour, and that's where everyone in the UK, let's say, would have a carbon allowance, and you would be able to trade that. And the idea being poorer people would be able to redistribute some wealth. I'll go through some of these bits of work. I'm conscious of time. So that work on personal carbon allowances, we went back to the Living Cost and Food Survey, which has a bunch of data on expenditure. So it has how much people have spent. It's a representative survey, and it has values for how much people have spent on everything you could wish for: biscuits, phones, insurance, energy, you name it, it's in there. It's a very, very detailed survey of expenditure. And we did some work effectively to take the energy expenditure in that survey and convert that to kilowatt hours. So we turned that back into energy use, and that became very useful because that's a representative sample where we could look at the distribution of energy use, but also then turn that energy use into carbon emissions. And we took that data and we built a model called DIMSA, the Distributional Impact Model for Policy Scenario Analysis. I don't know how I came up with that term. I invented this acronym and it stuck. It's a really stupid acronym. Anyway, we took this data from the Living Cost and Food Survey, which was at the time called the Expenditure and Food Survey. It's why it says EFS. And then we used the English Housing Survey and some data from Mori, who are a polling agency, to create a few, impute a couple of variables. And we reviewed UK energy policy using that data set. Effectively, we did that because at the time the government was getting very het up about the cost of energy policy on bills. And what we found was that it's not energy policies that are driving up the cost of energy bills, but that really the people who are hardest hit were the people who use electricity to heat their homes. And that's because at the time, most of the big costs of energy policies that have been added to people's bills were for renewables. But as I said, we've also used that data to look at the distribution of carbon emissions in the UK. So we did some work with Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and we also worked with the University of Oxford to effectively take that expenditure the expenditure on transport, on energy. We did some work using the aviation expenditure, but we used also an aviation survey, that a commercial aviation survey, because the data on aviation in the LCF is too patchy, because it's very difficult to work out the distance of a flight from somebody's how much somebody paid for a flight, because the values can be so variable depending on, you know, the time they booked or discount airlines and all that sort of stuff. So we had to use a different survey, but this remains, I think, the only study that's ever been done in the UK which has actually given a kind of statistically representable picture of UK emissions at the sort of household level. And what we found was that if you kind of add up the emissions by income decile, you get a picture that effectively you've got household fuels, private vehicles, public transport, and then aviation. You can see that unsurprisingly, as you go from poorest to wealthiest, the household emissions increase. And we then, what we found was that there's a triple injustice effectively, because the poorest households emit 3 times less than the richest. The impact of energy costs on bills are a much bigger proportion of the poorest people's bills. So you've got the lowest income households, they pay more towards the cost of climate change policies, they benefit less from them, and they're responsible for the least emissions. At the time, there was something called the feed-in tariff in the UK, which is where you can install solar panels and then get paid like a contribution towards them via the consumption. You got paid a very, very high amount back. That was extremely regressive, with like a small proportion of households benefiting, whilst everybody paid, because the cost of that policy was then added to everyone's bills. And the scenario we came up with to kind of improve the whole of the UK's housing stock at a cost of some like nearly 300 billion, I hasten to add, by 2050, we found that you could make that less regressive if measures were free to people on low incomes, funded predominantly via taxation, included some carbon pricing mechanisms to obviously try and address that kind of distribution, and placing a charge on wealthier households. That was 2013, and then we had a sort of change in direction in terms of government policy and government thinking. David Cameron at the time decided he was going to get rid of the green crap, and a bunch of policies were cut. So the the energy company obligation and the Green Deal were the policies at the time, and they were heavily cut back. So 2013 shows the huge drop. 2012, you can see that we were installing well over 2 million meshes a year, and 2013 that drops to only 500,000, and it's only just started to recover, to be honest. That had a massive impact. But we've had another massive geopolitical event in that, which the whole world is obviously aware of, which is the war in Ukraine, and that has again shifted the dial in terms of energy policy. So we've seen huge spikes in wholesale gas prices. And in the UK, we've got a price cap on bills. I don't know what the situation is in New Zealand in terms of regulation of fuel prices, but back in 2020, the government decided to introduce a price cap to protect those households that don't switch energy supplier. And the average bill was around £1,000 right up until, right through, COVID. And then what happened is, obviously, in the run up to the invasion of Ukraine, we started to see wholesale prices increase. And then at one point, the price cap was at £4,000. The government took unprecedented measures really to kind of intervene into the UK energy system. And, distributional impacts are back on the political agenda. So we've recently had meetings with Treasury and the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero about the work we did with DIMSA previously to look at the living cost and food survey to work out expenditure. And Ofgem, who are the energy regulator, asked us to update archetypes which we produce for them. So we take the LCF data that we've turned into consumption, and we use shade analysis to identify groups of households. And this chart shows you the kind of archetypes that we've given to Ofgem in the past. Ofgem use these to look at some of the price cap changes. They look at bill changes. They use these average consumption figures and these pen portraits. So you've got like E9, which is high income young renters, full-time employment, private renters, early adopters, smartphones, not fuel poor. And then you've got C5, very low income, single female adult pensioners, non-switchers, prepayment meters, disconnected, no phone or smartphone. So they're like, they're your kind of classic household that's excluded by many of the kind of offers, which rely on people being kind of internet savvy and being able to kind of get the best tariffs. So it's kind of come full circle. We went through a sort of process of the sort of political interest in fuel poverty and energy justice, kind of building from the 90s up until around 2010. And that was the sort of peak of our work, looking at distribution impact and energy policy. We did a lot of detailed work. And then things kind of declined. I mean, the civil servants were no longer kind of commissioning us to do work. In fact, the whole kind of policy agenda sort of stepped back really because fuel prices were lower. But we didn't sit on our laurels during that time. In 2018, we started putting together our Smart and Fair research program. So this is a research program which is involves more qualitative techniques. So it's not just looking at kind of large survey data sets. Smart and Fair really came about because our Chief Executive Simon Roberts was at a meeting and a lady called Alison Slatehome, who worked for National Grid, said what we need to do is make sure no one's left behind. So he came away from that meeting and thought about the future energy system, which will have quite profound changes for households. And hopefully, when we get smart meters installed in all households in the UK, we're up to about 53% or something at the moment, we'll be able to see a sort of transformation with flexibility services whereby people adjust their consumption to help balance the grid locally. Again, I'm not completely au fait with the energy system in New Zealand, but in the UK, we will have areas that are going to be constrained where demand is going to outstrip generation. We have more intermittent generation from renewables now. So we need to be able to be more responsive and balance the system. And that's why we need householders to be flexible. So we're seeing some of these services come forward. So there's energy suppliers like Octopus, which have time of use tariffs. If you've got an EV, like many wealthy homes, there are specific EV tariffs now. We're seeing people who've got solar panels, batteries, and EVs who have got time of use tariffs, who are maximizing their energy use. So at this time when the price caps, at £4,000, and the average bill, is astronomical, those people who've been able to afford those technologies have sort of insulated themselves from those costs. So the Smart and Fair program really is about making sure that no one's left behind, and particularly households on low incomes. And what we've done through Smart and Fair, we've developed a sort of capability lens through which these smart tariffs, these new offers, can be looked at to make sure that they are kind of fair and they are inclusive. I think when I talked about the Ofgem archetypes a minute ago, I picked the elderly household that's not digitally enabled, specifically because that highlights the fact that that household, actually, if you look at that, they might have a reasonable income, but actually, if they don't have the ability to use the internet, then in terms of Smart and Fair, these offers aren't going to be accessible for them. So we need to think about a future energy system that really includes their needs. So I'm nearly there. I'll wrap up in a minute because I realise you need some time for questions, but just another little bit of work we did recently. There was something called the DFS in the UK. It's the Demand Flexibility Service. So National Grid, as a response to the kind of stuff coming out in the press about Russia cutting gas supplies to Europe, about blackouts, we had things in the paper about blackouts. So National Grid said, we're going to run this demand flexibility service, and the energy system will make payments to households if they turn down their energy uses at set times. And if you're part of the DFS trial, we'll tell you what the times is, and you can take part. So over 1 million households took part. We evaluated that. And I think just, I guess, just as something to sort of leave you with, as a sort of something to think about, is the fact that we had 2 households really where both kind of who fell into this kind of category of probably, they've got long-term health conditions. One had very kind of negative experience. One had a really positive experience. They found it really easy. I used my phone. It was dead simple. And I suppose that's that in terms of our future work around sort of fairness in the energy system. That's one of the things that we're quite keen to focus on through Smart and Fair, is making sure that we're looking at the new emergent offers that are coming forward to make sure that we use that capability lens to understand how inclusive the offer is. Great, right, I'm going to stop there. I realise I've rattled on at an express pace. So thank you all for listening to me, and hopefully it was interesting and also intelligible.
Yeah, kia ora, Ian. That was great. It was really nice to hear that journey of attempts to understand the complexity of energy poverty and the complexity of the implications of policies that affect that. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, you can stick your hand up and we'll bring a mic around to you. And if you're online, just, I don't know if we can see, raise your hand or maybe shout out.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan Holmes. I work in Passive House community on energy efficient homes. I wonder if you can talk to, it seems to be that energy policy and energy hardship is a sort of symptom, and the disease is poor quality housing and obviously income levels. But if you can essentially heat your home with a hairdryer, if your house is very energy efficient, I wonder if you could speak to where you think the Scottish policy of moving their building standards to world best practice, what that will do for fuel poverty.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's ultimately a problem with the requirement to heat your home. So if you take that away, then you've no longer got a problem. I suppose the issue we have in the UK is some of the poorest housing in Europe compared to other countries. I mean, the UK housing stock's really not fit for purpose compared to kind of other if you look at some of the Scandinavian countries. So we do quite a lot of work on retrofitting homes. Unfortunately, because SAP is this now unifying standard that has been used to kind of benchmark food poverty, and then it became part of policy delivery. That's what we work to. So the current energy efficiency programs in England, if you're an EPC, say of E, you have to move 2 bands, so that's to a band C. Passive house would be like band A, be like A++. So there is a question about whether C, whether the existing policies we have in England are actually doing enough. As a minimum, we need to get everyone to C, but to hit our long-term targets, we need to be going beyond that. I think the solution from a net zero perspective is to electrify heat. Predominantly, that's the favoured approach. I think that's what we're going for, which will kind of address the carbon problem, but I think we'll still be left with an efficiency problem. So I've given you the context and I've agreed with you, but I don't think the current policies are kind of fit for purpose to end fuel poverty.
Thanks for that talk. I guess one of the things you were showing was that the distribution of carbon emissions and energy use across the UK was very important for sort of informing policy. I guess in New Zealand, we struggle, I think, with data to even kind of investigate that. And I imagine when you were starting out, you also struggled with data. And I guess, so I guess the question is, did you find that even with poor data, I guess you could still make meaningful statements?
Yeah, I think we were probably quite lucky in that there was already sort of established surveys in England. So in there was the English Housing Survey in 91 that ran in 96 and then 2001, and then became yearly. The Living Cost and Food Survey, which is the one that we've used to turn expenditure into energy use and carbon emissions, has been running for years in England. It was previously called the Expenditure and Food Survey. So I understand that in New Zealand you don't kind of have a sort of a comparable tool to draw on. So your alternative then is to look to what the community is collecting, because I'm sure you have got people out there who are doing work on energy and going into people's homes. It's the extent to which as a community you can kind of gather some data collectively, which I know that's always difficult, because you'll find that people have recorded information differently, recorded different things. I know through our advice services, CSE runs probably about 8 different services for different local authorities. We collect a core amount of information, but for example, we ran a program for a local authority and the eligibility was based on your being unwell, your health status. So that project had a huge amount of data about people's health and well-being, whereas other projects didn't collect that. So yeah, the challenge would be then going out to people doing stuff in the community and trying to gather something, make something out of it.
Any questions from the people online? Other questions from the room? I've got a question. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, one of the things I took from your talk was a shift from almost an entirely sort of quantitative data-driven understanding of energy poverty towards more understanding the nuances of the way people actually engage with energy and their household and that kind of thing in that Smart and Fair project. I wonder if you could just say about say anything about the integration of those two stories, I guess, if you want to say?
Yeah, so I think probably earlier than Smart and Fair, we did a piece of work called "You Just Have to Get By," which was a report written by a wonderful chap called Will Anderson, who's a very, very good writer, and that's where he did a whole piece of qualitative work with low-income households to gain more insight into their experiences. So that was probably around 2013. So we had done some of that work in terms of telling people's real life story, but I think as I guess as fuel poverty developed as a sort of a concept in the UK, initially it was very driven by academics who were researching it, defining it. It then kind of got basically put into law, into statute, and then that kind of research community continued. But as kind of as a sort of non-government, or as an NGO sort of lobbying that space, ourselves, National Energy Action, other people who Age UK, I think over time what we've kind of learned is that getting the attention of policymakers and civil servants and MPs, telling the actual story is more powerful than the numbers, because fuel poverty is like 5 million one year, 6 million the next year, 7 million next year, but when you're actually kind of when you've got the case study, somebody's or these days, back then it was like written case studies, now more and more it's like video testimonials, those are really powerful. So yeah, I think that's kind of slightly driven some of the more qualitative work. But I would say generally, because seriously, we are we're not funded, we have no core funding from anyone. We bid for work, we're kind of we act in the research space very much as a kind of competitive consultancy. We bid for work that government puts out, we do all sorts of stuff. So in a way our work is also slightly driven by where we can get funding. So I think the Smart and Fair work is obviously now being driven partly by the fact that electricity network, which used to be called district network operators, DNOs, the people that run the low voltage network, are becoming what we're calling DSOs, district system operators. And the distance between a DNO and a DSO is really around this ability to flex demand and balance the system. And for that to work, you can get your big factories like to turn down, and you can get your power stations to turn up, and you can put batteries on the system. There comes a point when households have to be involved, like the collective of households has to be part of that. And you can't, that's just not going to work unless you you really need to win people's hearts and minds for that to happen. And the UK energy system is pretty broke, to be fair, and we're a long way from that. So I think that's why the sort of Smart and Fair work really resonates.
Any other questions for Ian?
Sorry, another one from me, just because people are not asking questions. So I was just interested in the flexibility work, and I mean, it seems to me that peaks often happen during cold periods, at least in New Zealand. And so with the flexibility study that you showed, I mean, you sort of suggested that there was, there's this element of fuel poverty that is associated with the flexibility. And I mean, I don't think anyone wants people to have their homes go cold just to well, I mean, to keep the lights on, I guess. I just wondered if you could comment on the kind of interaction of those two things, and whether anything came out of the study that you did on that.
I guess the thing is, there's a real opportunity to make inroads with fuel poverty. So as an example, we've currently got a grant program in the UK called HUGS, which is the most ridiculous name ever, but Home Upgrade Grant Scheme, HUGS. And through that, fuel poor households are getting free insulation and low carbon technologies. They're getting free PV, for example, often alongside insulation, which is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But because a solar diverter doesn't gain any points for the standard assessment procedure, your EPC rating, a solar diverter is not even in the calculation. Therefore, they're not fitting them. They're not fitting them because it doesn't gain any points for the policy. But if you fit a solar diverter alongside a PV panel, then, you know, effectively, when there's excess energy, you can just charge up your hot water tank. So I think with these kind of flexibility services and these kind of new technologies, there is a real opportunity to make inroads with fuel poverty, but only if you're thinking about it in the design of policy, which government isn't. There doesn't seem to be any, you know. I did have a meeting with the fuel poverty minister the other day, and I managed to get my point into the civil servants. I made this exact point. I said, look, this is crazy. If anyone who was wealthy was doing this, they had a hot water tank, they do that. You know, so I think we're sort of missing a trick. And also in the future, if batteries become kind of more affordable, and, you know, there's all sorts of things that could happen with, you know, if we electrify heat and you've got a battery, you know, the wind's blowing, nobody's using that energy, the price drops, your battery charges itself automatically. You know, there's lots I think we can do in terms of flexibility to tackle fuel poverty, but only if the policies are designed to do that. And at the moment, it's just it's just they're a long way from that.
Got it.
It strikes me that a lot of the research you've done is from the past, and there's lots of peaks and troughs and a lot of stuff, you know, uncontrollable stuff. But what we really need now is research into what you've just talked about, into the future, you know, the technologies, and what if we do this and what if we have that. You know, the path of the technology is reasonably clear now. So, you know, how do we get people embracing it?
Yeah, so we do some of that work. So the research team do the heat network zoning work for the government. So we do the spatial analysis of where heat networks should go. So where's optimal, particularly for urban areas. And so those areas that aren't going to get a heat network would then, you know, they'll need something else, probably a heat pump, because I don't believe in hydrogen for domestic heating. I don't think it's going to happen. But I think where we're really struggling with this kind of answering this next question about flexibility services and where technologies can be deployed in an optimal way to help people is the low voltage network, is availability of data. So in the UK, the big wires are run by the energy system operator. That's the high voltage stuff. And when it gets the low, you know, when it gets stepped down to like the low voltage network and between the big wires and the house, that's all managed by these district network operators, the DNOs, who are going to become DSOs. Unfortunately, that data on the low voltage network is very analog. You know, it is in some cases it's like there was a picture of the network on a piece of paper and somebody scanned it and it's now a PDF. And they might know that, for example, they might know that the transformer has you know, a certain amount of headroom, but they can't tell you exactly which properties are connected to which transformer, and they can't tell you whether you know, the wires that property's on, if there are any issues. And there's all sorts of like foibles and strange things where properties are looped and connected to each other. And, you know, it is very analog. So I think one of the problems we've got with this kind of future facing research at a sort of community level is the fact that we just don't have the data on the state of the electricity network, and if we're electrifying heat, then that's critical.
So, I mean, do the policy makers know this is a huge problem and needs to be worked on, or is it just being left?
I think the people who work for the network operators understand that, and they are trying to digitize that information. They get into there's quite a big there's a big perceived data security issue with that. So what we have GDPR in the UK is what we call General Data Protection Regulations. It's our thing for overseeing like data sharing, and I think a lot of the network operators are concerned about sharing. You know, what we would like to do is digitize the low voltage network data, make that available openly, and then everyone would be able to kind of do research on that. I mean, that's how you get the most innovation and kind of speed of thought, is if you share tools, right? So but I think the network operators are a little bit worried about sharing their network data because it's critical infrastructure, and if you take people's electricity out, you know that gives you know, we live in dark times, I guess. I'm not sure government's really aware of this problem though, is kind of the answer to that question as well.
Well, thanks, Ian. I think we're going to have to call it there so that we can move on to morning tea. If everyone could join me in thanking you. That was a wonderful kickoff for our symposium.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Hopefully it was interesting and digestible. Thanks. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so we've got morning tea, and we'll come back at 10:45. It's being set up just here. If the people that are presenting in the session. Kia ora, we'll get started for the next session. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Amanda-Lanuola Dunlop to share with us insights from the Energy Hardship Expert Panel. That fortunately, all that hard work has just recently been released, so we can now actually see that final report, which is fantastic. So Amanda's really passionate advocate for well-being and Pacific health in particular, has been working in health policy, research and evaluation, and not-for-profit organization. And prior to taking on a role on the Energy Hardship Expert Panel, she was the chief executive of Vaka Tautua, a national Pacific health, disability, and social service provider. And we're really thrilled that she was able to join us today to give us some insights into the findings from the expert panel and their final report. So please join me in welcoming Amanda.
On here? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Energy hardship is hiding in plain sight in Aotearoa. It's time that we opened our eyes and do something about it. It's time for action. Kia ora koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki te Energy Wellbeing Consortium Day, te kore, te pō, te marama. Ko rangi, rawa ko papa, ko tēnei te timatanga o te ao, ngā mihi. Whaatalo whaatu le paia ma le mamalu, ma alo lava le suafua maua, ma le lange mama. As was shared, my name is Amanda-Lanuola Dunlop, and it's my privilege to be here today to share with you some of the insights on energy hardship in Aotearoa, specifically relating to our time as on the Energy Hardship Expert Panel, a time which has now come to an end. So I'm now sharing, as a public citizen, some of our insights from that journey. And I've purposely entitled my presentation Energy Hardship, even though I see here on the program it's Energy Well. Because in New Zealand, we're very accustomed in the policy, research, community world to take a strength-based, aspirational approach to our work. And indeed, that's something when we started our journey in September 2021, that's definitely the approach that we took, and we developed an outcomes framework, and we spoke about energy well-being. But in one of our very first meetings with kōrero, with our Māori community, they said to us, no, don't call it energy well-being. If you're taking out hardship, you're making us even more invisible. And, you know, people will really not see us. And so from there on in, our panel really embraced our mahi as energy hardship to make sure that we shine the light on what is really happening for many of our people in Aotearoa. If I can get this to move, here we go. So our energy hardship expert panel was appointed in September 2021 by Minister, the Honourable Megan Woods. And our purpose was to recommend strategies for addressing energy hardship in Aotearoa, which fell out of the electricity price review in 2019. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge some very important people who are part of our journey to bringing this report to life, because it was not our journey or our mahi alone. It was a collective journey and a collective response. First, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues on the Energy Hardship Expert Panel up here. Kerry Brown, our chair in the middle, Kevin Angland, Kay Brereton, and Helen Mahi. Amazing people, and I really thank and acknowledge them for their determination and unwavering commitment to this mahi and to people living in energy hardship. I'd also like to acknowledge Honourable Megan Woods for commissioning this work. It could have been very easy not to go ahead with it, but she was determined and she supported us and made sure that we could retain the independence that we needed to be true to this mahi. I'd also like to thank the Energy Hardship Reference Group, many of whom are here today. We thank you for your support and your challenging of us, and also the little ring rounds to make sure that we heard you and that we were on track. We had a Secretariat MB who also helped keep us on track and gave advice and did a lot of the hard mahi in the background. And I'd just also like to thank everyone who submitted feedback, the experts we called on, and the champions in the community. This work would not have been possible without you all. But of course, my greatest gratitude go to the people living in hardship for their bravery, honesty, and unwavering trust and hope in us to take their stories and use them to bring about change. And I'm sorry, because if you heard the stories we heard and you saw what we saw, it's unfathomable and unbelievable that we have people living in hardship in Aotearoa today. It's difficult. People can't access and afford energy. It should be a basic human right like water. It is not. That people are getting into energy debt, staying on energy debt, switching off, being switched off. Where do they go for help? That people and whānau are living in cold, damp houses, uninsulated, cooking on open fires because they have no electricity. And that's in urban Auckland. That's not out in the remote areas. Student renters here in Dunedin, we heard stories, cracked windows, mattresses, mould, making do. So they're landlord doesn't give them a bad reference for their next whare. You know, where's the help for them? What's the healthy home standards? What's happening there? And that people are literally choosing to heat and eat rather than heat. And we got a submission and we read all the submissions, and someone said, oh yeah, choosing to eat rather than heat, that's a really, that's a good little catchphrase. It's not that simplistic, but actually it is. When you go and see what's happening in some houses in New Zealand, it really is. Are we going to have food on the table, or are we going to feed our children? It is really that simple. Energy hardship in Aotearoa is in plain sight. We are just not seeing it or choosing to see it. Apart from us, of course, because we are vested in, we're part of this journey. But, what's the scale of the hidden hardship? Well, we don't know. And therein lies a big problem. We need numbers, facts, figures. They're crucial for informing policy, decisions, programs, funding. You need the numbers for a start. But we discovered very, very early in the piece that the evidence on energy hardship in Aotearoa is limited. When we started our journey in September 2021, there wasn't even a definition for energy hardship. That came 9 months down the track. There were no indicators or measures for energy hardship. So how do we know what it looks like? So the definition here is the definition of energy hardship that was developed by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, who are charged with leading energy hardship for the government. So they came up with that in June 2022, 9 months in, and that's been a useful starting point for conversations, although they use the energy wellbeing version, which is it flipped. When we spoke with people, we used the energy hardship version. And the indicators in 2023, they developed them then, just when we were ready to submit our report. But they are, they're great starting points for starting to discuss energy hardship and what it looks like. So what we had to do, we had to commission research, and we undertook an extensive engagement process to obtain new knowledge, new insights, to strengthen the evidence base. So we understood what energy hardship looked like. So our panel, we came up with these, which are drivers of energy hardship. What are they're the key influences, the factors that help bring about energy hardship. And hopefully you can see, but there were 8. It's a housing type, what type of, and the quality of your home, household needs, disabled, old people, appliance efficiency, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, energy resources, how you heat your home, that impacts on your energy hardship or well-being, the cost of energy, how much the power costs, how much to turn on that switch. Where you live in New Zealand influences, because there's different charge rates, household income, how much money your family has, how much is discretionary, and knowledge, knowing and understanding energy, bills, costs, all those things influence and impact on energy hardship. So it was important for us to understand that. And this was an important starting piece when we started to engage with individuals and whānau in energy hardship. For them, hardship's hardship. You come and say, I want to talk to you about energy hardship. They say, what's that? I only know hardship. And so this was really important for us to unpack. Okay, we're in financial hardship, and we're going to look at electricity and energy, and these are the types of things. Talk to us, what's happening, what's the challenges you face, and how do you think we can address those challenges? So it was really important as a starting point to start identifying what the drivers of energy hardship are. And then, as I said, in June this year, MB published 5 measures for measuring energy hardship that relate to our 8 drivers. Unfortunately, their measures only relate to 2 of our drivers. And so we have in our report asked for further work to be done on that, because if you're only looking at 2 of 8 drivers, you know, there's a huge knowledge information gap there. So that's something that we've recommended further work on. But just using MB's measures, this is what energy hardship in Aotearoa looks like as of June 2023. And it's our first picture. And if you have a look, without doubt, it's the same people who are popping up here. You know, it's our Māori Pacific, it's renters, low income, and what's not on there is disability, because there was no data to speak to that. But, you know, same people. And so really energy hardship is exacerbating the inequalities that these people are already facing. And as I said, this data is only based on 2 of the 8 drivers that we identified for energy hardship. You know, it only looks at housing type and quality. There's no measures for household needs, appliance efficiency, energy sources, location, and knowledge. But also when you look at, I'm going to take the top slide, the top bullet point, 110,000 households could not afford to keep their homes adequately warm. Therefore, they're living in energy hardship. That 297,000 people is based on the New Zealand average, which is 2.97. Well, if you look at Pacific people, 190,000 Pacific people live in a household of 5+. So if you have that many people, and no doubt our Māori whānau as well, they live extendedly. So you've already got a big, huge chunk, and they are the people that can't afford to do very much, then, you know, I mean, someone get a calculator. This 110,000 is way below. And again, that's the data we have. And so as I said, we did an extensive consultation process. And for us, it was really important to hear the stories of people who are living in energy hardship, but also those involved in preventing and responding to energy hardship in the community. And the previous speaker, he said, you know, it's not all about the stats, it's the stories behind that really give the power to those stats. And that's definitely something that we were committed to at the outset, was to bring those stories to life firsthand, so we could hear what they are facing, but also from their view and perspective, what needs to change to move them from energy hardship to energy well-being. We also invited public submissions in response to a discussion paper that we released in February 2023, and we got over 50 submissions. And that feedback has helped us to set what's in our report, which I know you've all read back to front and you'll probably cite better than I. But if you just look up here, some of the quotes there, yeah, it's pretty mind-boggling that we live with people putting up with what they have to put up with because they cannot afford energy, sufficient energy to warm their houses. So as Sean said, we submitted our report on the 31st of July, and it was released on the 7th of November. And the report is organised, there's 47 recommendations organised into 7 areas of action. So they're up there. If some of you were involved and provided submissions on the discussion document, so you'll be quite familiar with the areas of action here. And what they are, it's a mix of change, systems change. You know, it's a call for concerted efforts and commitment from government, the energy sector, and our community organisations to help address energy hardship. You know, it necessitates a mind shift, moving energy and access to energy as a human right, as a basic human right, just like water. Energy should be a human right, and it requires a commitment to empowering and resourcing our communities and ensuring that they are actively participating in this discussion. I do want to draw, now there's 2 or 3 up there that if some of you were part of the discussions going forward, you think, hey, I didn't really see that, or that didn't really stand out. And there are 2 area actions that were hidden, well, not hidden, they were in the discussion document, but as we heard more feedback and listened to our communities, we had no choice but to elevate them to be areas of action, and they're very pertinent to this forum here, so I do just want to touch on them. Of course, the first one is data and information. You know, we can't try and alleviate energy hardship if we don't actually really know what we're looking at. You know, we need to understand the numbers, the scale, the magnitude, who, and why. And so that's what this whole action area is about. It's about prioritizing energy hardship, developing the building blocks, the frameworks, the definition, the indicators, the measures, so we know what we're looking at. Drawing on the expertise. We have so many clever people and so many data sets, but we need to draw on those to get a complete picture of what we're looking at, and sharing the knowledge, including the electricity companies who collect data about disconnections. Well, share it. We need a picture. We all need to take responsibility for this. And definitely the new knowledge down there, research. You know, having been a researcher, there's hardly any new money for funding, but we actually need to understand what we're looking at before we move to evaluating how well we're doing it. So we put a fund in there as well. Of course, you can have all the best laid plans, but unless you have leaders who are committed and serious about addressing energy hardship and are accountable, then, you know, the best laid plans will just be plans. For us, you know, the overwhelming feedback, there's a lack of leadership, accountability and coordination in this space. Energy hardship's not a priority. Lots of governments doing lots of good things, but in silos, not connecting. Some of them are just staying in a little lane where if they flexed a bit, they could be doing so much more. And just a lack of independence in the whole system to monitor and hold people to account. And I thank you to everyone who thought that our group was a positive in that space. And people have recommended that a group like ours continue, because we need the voice keeping everyone to account. And of course, the last one that popped in there is, you know, is about community in action. Our community providers are the first people in hardship go to. They know their communities, they deal with them all the time, they know how to respond. So the real action is not at that bureaucracy. They need to set the frameworks and the conditions and the platform, but it's our communities that need to drive and lead the change, supported by the electricity. And so there was about having that community network, which CNN already provide the function. So for us, it's why reinvent the wheel? You know, MB was meant to have created this network over the last 3 years. It hasn't happened. We have a functioning group. We just want them to get on with it, but to expand, to bring in and have a Māori network and a Pacific. So we are really reaching those people in hardship. And they will also be looking after the upskilling, the building capability, but also the SEEK fund that is there to fund innovative community interventions. So where to from here? Well, it's a time for action. You know, we have a plan which suggests a way forward, 47 in fact. You can take any of those, any of them will bring about change, but we as a collective need to make sure this plan is implemented. Now, I acknowledge the assignment's got a little bit tricky and it's had its own challenges. For example, our plan was released under the cover of darkness. You had to look for it. And now we have a change of government. But that's nothing compared to the challenges that people in energy hardship face every day. So the government needs to act. We can't afford to have families, whānau, and future generations in energy hardship. All of us here are leaders in our own and champions in our own worlds, but as a collective, as an energy wellbeing evaluation consortium, we can all do our bit. We can all go and be bolder and braver and champion this report. Even just take the bits that you like in the report and champion them, go promote it. This is the time, if we really to have a chance at bringing about that systemic change that is needed. And to shine the light on that is energy hardship. Together we can make a difference. We just got to be bolder and braver. Ngā mihi nui, ia manuia le sofua maua.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful, contextualizing energy hardship for us all. We probably have time just for one question, but I do want to emphasize that we do have a panel discussion later on this afternoon where we can dive into a lot of these issues that Amanda has raised here in a lot more depth. But does anyone have a quick question? I don't think it's easy to have you can't ask a quick question about this kind of stuff. That's the challenge.
Like I can't talk for 20 minutes.
All right. I'm
hoping that quietness means you're soaking it up and you didn't, is it, I see see.
Yeah, kia ora, sorry. I'm sitting almost at midnight in my mom's 50 square meter flat in Austria that I grew up in. Kia ora koutou. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. I have to be quiet because I don't want to wake her up. But tautoko to everything you said, and I love this report, and I love our mahi, and I love our collaboration on it. And I'm very unhappy that, it's kind of getting lost a little bit. And I just want to ask you, tell us what we can do. Tell us what we can all do to bring this report to fruition, because I want to do everything I can to get these recommendations out there and to get this new government to not ignore it.
Thank you, C. And first, thank you for all your support during this journey. Really, it's promoting it, publicizing it. First, the report's been hidden. So our panel, as you know, our tenure ended on the 31st of July. We are actively out there promoting this mahi. That's how passionate we are about it. If you can go see your local MPs, if you know people, we need this report in front of the new government's noses. That's how important it is. And that's what we will be doing as independent people as well, because we can't afford for this important mahi just to be buried. So anyone and everyone, how to get the messages out that there is a report, that, the issues are important. Whether we agree with some of the things inside, it's the issues, it's the mahi. And we just really need people to take notice, open their eyes to what is happening in Aotearoa.
Kia ora. I'm the one who got Bernatiki to write about it, and he's willing to talk to anyone to keep moving this up and forward as well. So hopefully we can keep a bit of pressure on.
Thank you, C.
All right.
Thanks you.
Thanks very much. We'll move on to the next sessions, and we'll certainly pick up on this in the panel session. So, thanks again.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Vicky. I have the pleasure of chairing this next session. We've got 4 fantastic speakers. We'll just jump straight in, kicking off with C from Austria, we've just heard. Thank you so much for joining us, C, and keeping your eyes open this late. I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora. It's absolutely bizarre. I just came from a dinner with all of my primary school friends that I've known since I was 6 years old, and their moms. And now I'm sitting in my mom's flat, as I said, 50 square meter, talking about energy poverty. I certainly know the lived experience, and I don't want any other tamariki to go through that. So I really hope next year I can finally be actually in person at the conference, because I'm always just calling in from somewhere in the world, and I hate not being there and spending more time with you. So thank you so much. I want to just ask this question: are the majority of energy users really hard to reach, or are we not trying hard enough to reach them? I'm pretty sure you already know what my answer is. But I did 5 years of research to get to that. So I'll just very quickly talk a little bit about that research, about some of the lessons from our first phase of the Hard to Reach task under the Users Technology Collaboration Program of the International Energy Agency. And then also, it seems like I've stupidly somehow managed to save my recordings, and so it's going to go forward without me doing anything, which is bad. Anyway, my research has led me from behavior change, the first global research collaboration, behavior change and demand-side management, realizing all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. So we need to really focus on the behavior changes and trying to change their behavior so that they can change behavior better. And then realize that they are not actually looking at the vast majority of energy users, which is how we started the Hard to Reach energy users task. And now we realize that we have to stop applying band-aids with ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, and instead actually address the systemic issues of energy injustice. And this is what this new research phase that we just started is kicking off with Aotearoa Electricity Authority. Love you guys for supporting this, the Swedish Energy Agency and the Department of Energy in the US. And we're actually going to focus not just on hard to reach energy users, but hidden energy users. So we're going about as hard as you can go, because they are the ones who really need to be brought, their voices and their communities' voices need to be brought to the fore. And just very quickly, our definition of hard to reach energy users is very broad on purpose, because we really didn't want to miss anyone, because too often we just jump to thinking it's just about energy poverty or energy hardship or low income. And instead it is not. What we also did is we developed a research framework, a process to use, which is based on an amalgamation of community-based social marketing, design thinking, behavioral science, and just really robust social science, mixed methods, so that you can actually follow the proper process and don't start with the engagement strategies without having figured out who your allies and stakeholders are and who your audience is. This is really just to give you some links to some of the stuff that we've done. We've really done a lot of stakeholder analysis and landscape analysis, and the big one was what we call the BEAST, which is our literature review, where we reviewed almost 1,000 pieces of literature to try and characterize all these different hard to reach energy users. And of course, there's a lot of criticism about the terminology, which is correct. We shouldn't put the onus on them. They're not hard to reach. We're not trying hard enough to reach them. So here's the answer to my question that I posed, 4 years of research. And what we also found is there is like so much focus on low income households and renters, and hardly any on like hard to reach are also high income, high consumers, small businesses, micro businesses, anyone in the commercial sector who's not in office buildings, and then especially those marginalized and hidden energy users that are very much in the too hard basket and who often don't want to be found. What was really shocking was we hypothesized it was about 30% of energy users, and instead we found it was more like 2/3, if not 3/4, and that's globally. So that is a really large chunk of energy users that we're not doing enough to reach them, and we're not doing enough to really understand their psychographics and their needs. There's a lot of segmentation that's based on demographics and like figuring out the barriers, but instead we should actually spend a little bit more time understanding their actual lived experiences and needs. And that means also talking to their community navigators. And so we did 19 case studies. We analyzed 19 case studies in 8 countries around the world. We used our building blocks framework to do an ex-post analysis. We looked at the different methodologies that were applied, strengths and weaknesses, and then we did a cross-country case study comparison, which we just published, that really looks at where we're missing some things and what were common engagement strategies. Very clearly, we need to talk to our whānau in the community who are actually really understanding the lived experience. They are our navigators, but often they're also our gatekeepers, because there's a lot of trust issues and fear of what we're going to do with the whānau's data and how we're going to treat it. We need to do true co-design of interventions and pilots, not just tokenism. We really need to acknowledge that they are overburdened and under-resourced and actually pay them for that time. We need to train them, but like, you know, in a way that actually makes sense. Again, co-design the training rather than just coming up with something and handing it over, because the face-to-face and tailored in-home advice obviously works best. And we all know in Aotearoa that kilowatt hours and greenhouse gases is not what we want to talk about to those whānau. We need to talk about health and well-being. We did a lot of field research in North America, particularly with the utility sector, on a whole lot of different different hard-to-reach energy user groups. And then in Aotearoa, we worked on the whānau heat kits under the SEEK Fund. May it continue, may it prosper, may we be able to do more on our heat kits. And then with this mahi on hidden hardship that we started with Mercury and Genesis reports coming out really soon. So some of the lessons we've learned is it's really important to actually have clear definitions, and that's something that we always co-designed in our research, because it's very easy to get sidetracked by what people mean when they're talking about energy behavior or behavior change or hard to reach energy users. And even though the definitions are never perfect, it is quite important to like make them quite clear and agree on them in some way, so that you can actually, you know, frame what you're actually working on. We also know what works, and that's to follow a strong co-design process. And if we could agree on the standard process of how we're doing these things so that we can compare and contrast our mahi, that would be really good. That of course includes the E in this, which is the evaluation and the metrics and the deployment, but it also includes the how we talk to stakeholders, how we reach out to those community navigators, how we do co-design, how we sub-segment our audiences and actually define our behaviors, and then of course how we deliver those programs and actually test them in the field. I don't think I need to say this with this audience, but I'm going to say it anyway. The energy system is inherently white supremacist and Eurocentric. It's been built that way. It's dominated by the engineers and the economists. It's dominated by male scientists. It's dominated by European and American scientists. It's dominated by anyone who's in the quantitative fields. And so what we're really, really, really needing to put some money towards and some respect towards is the female scientists, the social scientists, the minority scientists, the global south scientists, because we're missing those voices. And so we keep continuing designing things and researching things that have this bias and privilege attached to it, which means that we're just like not actually doing the mahi that needs to be done for those 2/3 or 3/4 of energy users in the world. We know that we need to talk and engage to trusted community middle actors, but that's not easy. And they have no reason to trust us. They have built those trusted relationships over many years, and because they share those lived experiences with their whānau, and suddenly we roll in as the experts with all our solutions, and we kind of like, you know, just want to like offer our support or help, and like you need to build those relationships first, and that takes time, and we can't burden our community navigators with all this extra time. So we need to make it as easy as possible and pay them for the time and actually build those relationships properly and do our own mahi as well to understand, you know, the cultural sensitivities around dealing with some of those vulnerable communities, priority communities, we should call them. We shouldn't call them marginalized or vulnerable anymore. We should just call them priority communities, and everyone should just agree on that. we know what not to do, and that is to just like roll in with the solutions, with the programs, with the subsidies, with the incentives, with the mass marketing campaigns that cost millions of dollars, without first listening to what is actually needed and what they want to hear and how they talk to each other, and like what will actually land, because most of these giant awareness campaigns that we spend so much money on never land with the energy users that I'm talking about. All those big surveys, all the voices you hear back, they're not their voices. And so we're kind of like constantly just digging into this blind spot, and we really need to do better. And this is also what I'm saying to the International Energy Agency again and again. They're really focusing on awareness campaigns right now. And, you know, we got to acknowledge that the energy policy area is one of a trilemma, where there's a constant tension between energy security, which is around the politics, which is around access of energy, the economic side of things, which is around, you know, like
if you can hear us, see, we've lost you temporarily. We've lost sound. I don't know if that's a glitch at our end or your end. The guys are looking at it here.
Both the profits and sustainable economists have had such an outsized influence over policy and law, especially.
You can hear us, see, we've got some connection issues. I think you're frozen here.
Sorry, I don't know when I fell off, but yeah, I'm hotspotting from my phone, and my mom doesn't have Wi-Fi, so apologies for that.
We were on the trilemma slide.
Yeah, on the trilemma. Basically, it's not a trilemma, it's a quadrilemma, and we really need to put the justice and equity lens at the center of this constant balancing of the policy, the politics, the environment, and the economics. We really need to take energy justice and the human side at the center of it, because, you know, it is about democracy. It is about having an equitable access to it. And a lot of that is centered in policy and law. And this is why I'm so passionate about ensuring that the 6 years of work from the electricity price review on, and now this mahi with the report, doesn't get lost because there's a new government. That would just be an idiotic waste of money and mahi, and we don't have the time. And our people don't have the time. So just to finish off, what we're doing now is we are looking how the current energy crisis, which is really an injustice crisis, is unfolding in the different countries that are funding us, who the hard-to-reach energy users are, who actually do remain hidden from interventions, or who are living in hidden hardship, and the reasons why, because they're quite different for the different subgroups. So really want to nut into that. Who the navigators and gatekeepers are that have trusted relationships with them. And again, they'll be quite different for the different groups. How we can better improve our research methodologies and approaches to engagement. And that includes decolonizing or re-indigenizing our processes. And actually, when we're doing co-design, really giving the leadership to especially our Indigenous or Pacifica whānau in Aotearoa. Unfortunately, I'm getting to work with Indigenous communities in each of the countries that are supporting this. So it's going to be really interesting seeing how the different Indigenous and traditional knowledge approaches work. And then, of course, also like talking about what the cultural and country differences are and the similarities when we engage those energy users. And I'm going to leave it with that. If there's any questions, I hope I get to answer them, because unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump off and let my mom go back to sleep soon.
Thank you so much, C. Such an important piece of research, and I think really highlights and emphasizes that some of those numbers we saw in the last presentation are such a woeful underestimate of energy hardship in Aotearoa. We've probably got time for one quick question, and we'll, if anyone has one for C before we let her go to bed. All quiet here. Anything online? Okay, well, if everyone could just join me in thanking C again for fantastic presentation.
Okay. Good night. Have a great conference, everyone.
Good sleep. And now I have the pleasure of welcoming Janet to the podium. Janet is going to be talking to us about evaluating energy hardship interventions from frameworks to measures. Thank you, Janet.
Great. Kia ora koutou. Oh, is this working? Great. Looks like there's something else technical going on here. Those of you online, we're just trying to connect to the internet here, I think. Actually, you probably don't need my slides for me to start. So kia ora koutou while the technical stuff's going on. It's a real pleasure to be here today and see lots of old friends in the energy field and the energy hardship field who I've worked with over many years. My talk today is really, I suppose, building on lots of conversations we've had across the Energy Hardship Evaluation Consortium, which is a collective of lots of different organisations working with households in energy hardship. And also inspired by the recent work by the Energy Hardship Expert Panel, which is, has been really exciting to see finally come to light. Now, this bit of tech isn't working. Now, I can't advance my slides. Okay, let's hope this works. Okay, so sorry about the technical issues here. So the consortium, when we set up, we developed some terms of reference for what we were about. And it was really to just enable sharing between all of us, what we did, our experiences and methodologies and evaluation tools, but particularly also to support a more standardized and comparable approaches to evaluating energy hardship projects that we were undertaking. In terms of that evaluation process, which is what I'm going to focus on now, the issue is that there are lots and lots of different organisations working in this space, from really big government agencies with a lot of dollars to spend, businesses who are investing in this, from retailers and lines companies and so on. There are Māori organisations, there are NGOs, and there are community organisations, right down to little tiny groups of 2 or 3 people doing amazing stuff. And I'm going to call them energy hardship change agents when I'm talking about all of those together. And also across them, everybody's undertaking a huge range of different kinds of interventions, from like eco-subsidies to actually undertaking physical alterations in houses, to whānau support, energy education, budgeting advice, home energy audits, and the list goes on. So lots of different kinds of organisations doing lots of different kind of stuff. But what we actually really want to know is how effective are our actions or interventions in reducing energy hardship, because after all, that's what we're there for. And that's what evaluation is for. But across all those organisations, of course, we've got a wide range of capability in evaluation. It involves going out, asking questions, gathering data, analysing it, managing it, storing it, all of that, and that costs time and it takes a lot of money as well, or some money. But importantly, if we want to know this stuff, how effective have we been, the data gathered should support us as individual organisations in comparing what happens, what the situation was before to what the situation is after we've done that thing. And ideally, it would enable us to compare between different kinds of interventions. Is for this group here, is this a better intervention than that intervention over there? So those sorts of questions. And to do that, I argue we need a consistent and inexpensive set of questions that can be asked. So we can look at evaluation at different scales, and we've been talking about this already today. That sort of high-level monitoring of the effectiveness of big government policies, that's kind of the MB space. And then you've got this sort of mid-range of measures of success. And so if you've got a big organisation or a well-funded research project, you can do detailed surveys, you can put in temperature monitors and so forth within the homes, and you can gather a huge amount of data that you can do a lot of great stuff with. But if you're the little organisations at the bottom, and there's many more of them than they are of the big ones at the top, you actually just want a few measures that are pretty simple, easy to gather, and you can do on a face-to-face basis. So these smaller scale change agencies just need these few simple questions that they can undertake before and after interventions. But ideally, those same questions could also be asked at that mid-scale and could also inform that higher scale. So we've got a picture of what's happening at the bottom across all of these interventions, feeding through up to the top where we're looking at what's happening across New Zealand as a whole. So we've seen this diagram already today, the Energy Hardship Expert Panel, identifying key drivers or causes of energy hardship. And I'm going to use the cultures framework, which I've probably talked to you about before, as a way of thinking about what do change agencies have the capacity to actually change in terms of those drivers of energy hardship. And here we've got a whānau, they've got some stuff, they've got the stuff they have, they've got the stuff they do, and they've got their sort of the ways they think and understand the world that are causing that they're locked into, that is causing energy hardship. And they also have what we call the agency barrier. There's stuff they can do, but there's a whole lot that they can't because they don't have the capability or the money or the ability to make changes. And there's a whole lot of external forces out there, these structural forces that or influences that the Energy Hardship Expert Panel has identified that are actually placing many families in this situation. So in that light, what can change agents actually achieve? Well, they probably can't do much about house type, but they can do a bit about house quality. So they can do things like insulation, clean heating. They can achieve, they can't do much about household needs, those are a given. They can do a bit about appliance efficiency. They can do a little bit about energy sources. There's some groups putting in solar power. They can do a little bit about energy costs. They probably can't do much about location. They can do a bit about household income, and they can help with knowledge. But additionally, they can assist with energy practices, i.e. people learning maybe the need to ventilate their spaces or not, in the case of students, to stop hanging their wet clothes up inside. But what to evaluate? And I think we often get confused about evaluating the causes, and then gathering data on actually the interventions that we undertake. ECA loves that kind of data, how many houses have been insulated. But importantly, actually what we should be evaluating is the outcomes. So what are the outcomes of those interventions? And a way of looking at that is through this energy wellbeing definition, when individuals, households and whānau are able to obtain and afford adequate energy services to support their wellbeing in their home or kāinga. So very quickly, based on that definition and the work of the Energy Hardship Evaluation Consortium and the panel, my suggestion is that at least some of the desired outcomes are affordable energy services, well-being or better well-being, drier, warmer homes, confidence in feeling supported in making decisions around energy, and also equity. So can we develop some baseline questions, I argue, that actually inform those outcomes? Maybe 1 or 2 questions for each. For example, and these are taken from the CEN questionnaire list, which was developed by Kim O'Sullivan and Neville Pearce, and there's about 20 questions in this list. All good. This one here is about relates to affordable energy services. We could have a health and well-being question or 2. We could have a home quality question or 2. We could have a confidence question or 2. And we could have a couple of questions that show the equity implications of those changes. And so where I leave you is let's actually make evaluation simple, outcome-focused, affordable, informative, and comparative, and in ways that every energy hardship change agent has the capacity to apply a simple number of, say, 10 questions to the households before and after intervention that can then feed up into those broader data sets, but can also help those organisations understand the effectiveness of their interventions. And I'd love to hear some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Janet. Really applaud your work you've done. And great to see that starting to take effect as well with the work with SEN and the universities in developing those first set of questions. Any thoughts, comments, questions for Janet from the room? Gareth.
Maybe it's more of a statement than a question, but just acknowledging that some of those more quantitative measures that you put slightly higher up there, we want to do those in the sort of the face-to-face stuff as well. So energy sensors and temperature and humidity and what have you, they sort of provide a bit of a more complete picture. So quite interested in how you think or where you think the connections between those 3 layers could be improved so that we can do a better job at that pointy bit.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, ideally, if we as a nation had the funding to enable every house that had an intervention to have, you know, those technical measurements, that would be ideal, but it's probably not realistic. So my suggestion around having a common set of very easy, simple face-to-face type questions is just to enable everybody to engage in that. But I certainly agree, and maybe I think there's probably some useful research in linking those measurement-based indicators with human experience-based indicators to see what's the consistency between the two. And I think that's probably a useful piece of work to be done.
Any other questions from the room or any online? Sean?
Thanks. I was just wondering if you could reflect or make the connection to C's presentation around the hard to reach and the kinds of questions that you're suggesting there.
I'm not quite sure. Yeah. I mean, C's discussion of hard to reach was incredibly broad and included businesses and so forth. So if you were going to make this that extensive, it might require really rethinking how you worded some of those questions. So that would be one issue. But I think fundamentally, you know, if you're asking about affordability and if you're asking about well-being, then those are pretty general questions that would suit any kind of hard to reach person. But hard to reach means hard to reach. So if people, I think the important thing to me is, if we're going to be serious about this, questions have to be ones that anybody working in the space is comfortable to ask, and anybody who is a household is comfortable to answer, because we don't want to be asking intrusive questions that make people feel whakama. So that's a piece of work I think that we need to work on.
Yeah, maybe some aspect of co-design embedded in that.
Yeah, yeah.
Possibly one quick question if anyone's got one. Back of the room, making me run around.
Thanks, Janet. I'm just wondering, more, again, maybe an annoying question, but it seemed like a lot of the low-hanging fruit interventions would also be the harder to measure ones. How do you suggest we deal with that trade-off?
Well, I think what we're not measuring actually the intervention itself. Like, have you had a sit down with this family and had a conversation about energy knowledge? It is does it make a difference afterwards compared to before, for this family to have had that sit down discussion around the living room about energy knowledge? So I think those kind of questions are probably equally applicable to a really low key intervention as to a really intrusive intervention like clean heating and insulation and so forth. I don't really see any difference there.
Thank
you. Thank you if everyone could join me, and I think we're out of time. Sorry, through a hand waving. Oh, maybe you can put it to the panel. Thank you, Janet. Everyone could join me in thanking Janet.
Thank you.
And now I have the pleasure of inviting Phoebe Taptiklis from Motu. I think I can officially say, as of yesterday, Dr. Phoebe, who's just got her PhD. And she's going to be sharing some live lessons from some evaluations that she's currently doing with MB.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much for that welcome. Yeah, there was a bit of a typo. This is supposed to be life lessons, and I've actually gone and changed the title anyway, because I realized I wanted to get on my favorite hobby horse soapbox, so I'm going to rush through my slides to see if I can get on that at the end. I think it's really nice that I'm following on after Janet, because I actually think that some of what I'm going to talk about today speaks to potentially some measures that can be included by evaluations that may not be very well funded. So how do we do these? Okay, so I'm just going to so I've been involved now in a couple of large evaluations through Motu. So I'm going to speak to the Womakiwi study, which is already completed, and a second study which is ongoing. The Womakiwi study, we did monitoring of temperature and what have you in 176 households before and after they had a heat pump installed through the Womakiwi Homes programs, so subsidised. Actually, they changed the subsidy. Like at the very start, it was 90% subsidy, and then they changed it to 80%, but that didn't affect us too much. Because of the situation in 2021, we ended up extending the study for a bit longer, which was quite good in that it meant that we asked our participants to stay on for an additional year, and we ended up with 95 households who did stay on for the second year of the study. And in those households, we've got data for 2 winters and a summer. So that's a bit of a bonus. We just did living room monitoring, and we also linked with the Electricity Authority smart meter data and with the Clyflow weather station data. And it's these last 2 types of data that I really want to sort of promote today. And in fact, while I'm on that topic, can I just ask a question of the audience, and including the online audience? Can you please raise your hand if you have ever used the Electricity Authority registry hub to access smart meter data? Okay, great. Okay, great. That's really good to know, because it was so clunky that I wondered if anyone else had ever gone through the process before. So I'm glad to see that people are, because it is actually a pretty awesome resource. So this data from the Womakiwi Womakiwi study is actually available. There's masses and masses of data, and there's still an awful lot of work that could be done with this data. So if you have a project and you think this data resource might suit your research topic, then get in touch and we'll see if we can make this data available to you or your students for research projects. So the project that I'm working on at the moment, which is the Public and Maori Housing Renewable Energy Fund Evaluation. This fund came about as actually was stimulus funding due to the COVID pandemic, and the government looked at ways to get lots of money out into the community. And so $28 million was allocated to community-led renewable energy interventions. And altogether there were, I believe, 42 small-scale community-led projects. And there's the large-scale ones have just been announced. I think there was 18 large-scale. It's 95% solar. There is a really interesting mix though within the solar. There's with batteries, there's without batteries. Kāinga Ora got half the funding to install solar panels on their homes, and they have opted for no batteries, which I think makes sense for Kāinga Ora because they can roll it out to more households that way. So there is some really interesting projects going on with different sharing strategies, different ways to share the, so some of the projects have just got individual panels on individual homes. Other ones they've set up an array and are going through various different ways of sharing the electricity amongst their whānau. Cool, okay, I'm only on my second slide. Right, so yeah, onto the EA data registry. So also I wanted to say thanks to Rangimaria Aperahama, who has helped me putting together these slides and is also our resident Electricity Authority data request expert. If you want to reach anyone at Motu, we're all first name dot last name at motu.org. So do reach out if you want to talk about any of these. So this first bullet point is from the EA documentation. The registry system is intended primarily to enable consumers to switch electricity retailers. So in particular, to make sure that no one's going to get double charged, you know, if you want to switch. And also prior to this being set up, it was quite difficult to switch electricity retailers and to make it all work for you as a consumer. You tended to but so that's the reason that this exists. So providing data to researchers is not a primary goal. It's just a nice bonus that happened as a result of setting up this system. And that's why it's pretty clunky and there are a lot of hoops to jump through to access this data. The first hoop, which might seem really difficult for a lot of organizations, is that you have to sign a waiver agreeing that you're going to let yourself be sued for lots and lots of money. And I know that's been a sticking point for some larger organizations, not just smaller ones. Personally, I think it's a bit of a red herring. Our position was that we have indemnity insurance, and that it was easily covered under that. And frankly, you know, as long as you go through your processes okay, where you get informed consent, I can't actually see anything that you could be sued for. And of note in relation to that is, it's really important to note that there is no pricing information available through this system. You're only getting kilowatt hours produced. And as per the previous slide. The whole point of this system is to allow all the retailers to maintain their IP and their privileged business information while allowing access to the data. So I think it's actually a pretty good system. So if you're going to go and, so I wouldn't worry about that, signing that waiver myself. As a researcher, you're considered an agent, so you're not on the system at the same level as the retailers are, and you can't actually get access to the same types of data as the retailers can. You need to collect informed consent from your participants, and I should have put this on a slide, but this is what you need to have on your consent form. You need to have the exact correct name on the electricity bill, spelt exactly correctly. You need to have the retailer. You need to have asked them, because there's 2 years worth of backdated data stored permanently. You need to ask them if they have changed electricity retailer in that time, and if they have, you'll have to make 2 separate requests or even more to each of those retailers, because the requests go to each retailer. So the name, the retailer, if they've changed, if I remember something else later, I have to tell you. Trying to rush through this. Okay. We can't look at, there is a register that collects all the information about when people switched ICPs and companies, but you can't access that. So you have to, as a researcher, you have to get that information separately yourself. When you put in a request, you have to download this WinSCP software. It's really clunky. You produce your request in this Excel format. It has to be exactly perfect. If you have one typo, one space even incorrect, it will just come back with nothing, with zero information on why you didn't get any data, and you will have to do forensic analysis to understand why you didn't get any data back. And even when you do get the data back, we're finding that frequently you're having to redo the request at least 3 times to get the data that you actually want. Like, you ask for half-hourly data, but you might get monthly data and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, we also use Clydeflow data, and I didn't even get to my graphs. This is what you can do if you get all this data. And so I do think that this is really worth some of those smaller organizations considering. Clydeflow data is clunky but easy. Clydeflow data, in my experience, you're finding hourly data within about 10 to 15 kilometers of any target household, and it's worth it. It's free. Whereas monitoring individual houses for outdoor temperature is definitely not free. And this graph shows external temperature across the bottom, internal temperature on the y-axis, and you can see like how much detail you can get into these kind of analyses with these types of data. So houses with a heat pump, you can see we're reaching the WHO level of 18 degrees Celsius indoors at 5 degrees of external temperature, whereas without a heat pump, the houses are not hitting that same 18-degree mark until it's over 15 degrees outdoors. So pretty interesting. This is some preliminary results from the current study. This is only 9 households because we're still collecting data and everything. These are houses with solar panels. And the first slide is June 2022, before they had solar panels. The second picture is the same 9 households in June 2023 when they did have solar, and you can see the hourly drawdown from the grid of electricity there. The afternoon peak has almost halved, and then that's just using the hourly export data of the EA adjusted here for temperature. You can also, I wanted to talk about how you can start to see a bit of behavioral stuff in these, because you can see here that when you hold temperature steady, that this morning, that trough in the middle of the two peaks almost disappears. So it would almost suggest that that trough is really due to people in these 9 households turning off or down their heaters during the day in between those two peaks. Also importantly, pretty interesting, June, the least sunlight hours, these houses from Christchurch to Northland, and they're still having a really good impact. Sorry, I've gone way over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. In the interest of keeping us on track, we'll save any questions for the panel, or people can catch you at lunch, so we don't delay lunchtime. Our final speaker in this session, Hinerangi from Orion. Going to hear about some of the fantastic work you guys are doing in Christchurch, I believe.
Okay. Tēnei te mihi ki te kaumātua hei whakarite ana tēnei kaupapa, kai raro i te maru o te tika me te pono, o tira ki te mana o tēnei whenua, ka tīmāmoe waitaha, te papa tupurunanga o tākau, tēnei te mihi, kia koutou katoa, kia ora, ko mōkau ki runga, ko tāmaki ki raro, ko manga toa ki Wainganui, ko pare hauraki, pare waikato, ko te nehe nui tainua ki te kaukaro o Patitere, ko ēnei ngā whenua o ōku nei tūpuna, o te waka o Tainui, o kia ora, tēnā tātou, ko Hinerangi Pere tōku ingoa. Kia ora everybody, I just wanted to start by acknowledging our kaumātua this morning who opened up our proceedings in the right and grounding way. And the reason why I say that is because in his karakia, and I know there may be many that don't understand te reo Māori, but he spoke about the various elements around us. And that's significant because this is an energy research symposium. And so those natural elements are the reason why we're here. And we're talking about energy, and that relates to wind, water, sun, and everything else. So yeah, I just wanted to make point of that. So kia ora everyone, my name is Hinerangi Pere. I am the new head of community energy services for Orion in the Ōtautahi area. Still fairly new to the organisation, but not new to the space of energy. My background, I come from an iwi background, having worked for my iwi for many years. Waikato Tainui in the north, but I was raised in Ōtautahi. So just a little bit of a kōrero about myself. Okay, so my kōrero today is about being a force for good, powering a cleaner and brighter future with our communities. Okay, who is Orion? Okay, so Orion owns and operates the electrical distribution infrastructure in central Canterbury. It includes Ōtautahi Christchurch, and our network is both rural and urban and extends to 8,000 square kilometres from the Waimakariri River in the north to the Rakaia River in the south. And from Banks Peninsula to Arthur's Pass. We deliver electricity to more than 220,000 homes and businesses within our region. And we're the third largest EDB or electrical distribution business in Aotearoa. So I also want to acknowledge some of our partners. So you'll see that there's Orion there. Alongside Orion, I wanted to mention our principal subsidiary, Kinetics. Their core business is to design, construct and maintain the overhead and underground power lines, and is also our service for emergency works as well as logistics. And Kinetics supports Orion's core business through designing, building, maintaining, and developing our network. I also wanted to mention the Energy Academy, who are currently running the Global Quest Challenge next year. And they are also a big part of us understanding the ways to retain and grow talent throughout the industry, as well as the Orion Energy Accelerator Program, a very good friend of mine, Shirley, and this is to funnel creators, innovators through the program, resulting in some startups that have innovative solutions to some of the challenges that we face, especially the transition into net zero 2050. And you can find all of these on our webpage. I feel like I'm really plugging Orion today, but I guess you'll all walk out of here knowing who we are. So this is the Orion group strategy, and the reason why I pull this up is I think it's really significant in the sense of the wording. So the purpose is that we're powering a cleaner and brighter future with our communities. And we're doing that so that we can drive prosperity for our region through balancing energy affordability, energy security, and sustainability. And those are our main focus areas. But for this particular kōrero, I want us to focus on focus area number 3, which is being a force for good in the communities we serve and enabling the net zero transition. And so why is this so important? It's from this that community energy services for our EDB came about. So community energy services is about driving positive change with our communities by co-creating impactful energy services that bring meaningful benefits to households. And so Orion understands that to drive positive change, it needs to do this with and alongside our communities. Communities in our region are already doing amazing mahi. And I really want to highlight that there are place-based solutions and more localized solutions to some really complex challenges out there, especially with the rising cost of living. It's becoming more challenging at a household level to meet everyday costs. And one of those is energy, our panel from the Energy Hardship panel spoke about earlier this morning. And we're really mindful and conscious about this in our region, and especially when it relates to energy equity, affordability for our communities that we serve. And it's from this place that community energy services was created within Orion to ensure that as our region transitions into net zero 2050, none of our communities are left behind. And that's the key to this, that none of our communities are left behind, and that every decision we make as an organization is reflective of this. So what is Orion's role in all of this? I think one of our roles is to ensure that we support and empower our communities, especially around community-based energy initiatives that enhance regional energy resiliency and affordability, that we enable equitable utilization of the infrastructure and network by communities, and that we increase the level of energy, that we support those groups that are already working out in our communities to increase the level of energy literacy, efficiency, and education throughout our region. And sometimes this is the lead-in point for those households to learn about energy. So we can never underestimate the importance of that literacy piece, that education piece. Sometimes that's a stepping stone to be able to think of energy in a wider context. And we continue to support the Healthy Homes initiatives throughout our region. So some of the stuff that we are looking at, and I've spoken about community groups they're a big part of the transition. And so the Canterbury Energy Wellbeing Collective was established. It brought together a group of communities. We're all really diverse, services and agencies throughout our region to collaborate and with the aim of elevating the level of energy well-being within our regions. We acknowledge that there's energy hardship, but we want to increase energy well-being as well. So not only that, we've also supported and we've endorsed quite a few of the entities that are currently already doing amazing mahi and their applications to the SEEK Fund. Ooh. We've only got 1 minute. We haven't even started. All right, we're going to make this quick then. Okay. So why communities, why are communities at the Centre for Change? A locally led energy transition is key to delivering net zero in the cheapest and most effective way possible, with more local support, better tailoring to local needs and economic and social benefits. This is from our statement of intent. And what I think is really important in all of this, and it's been said all throughout the morning, is that we need to take a whole systems approach. There is an ecosystem here that we need to look at so that as we do look at this transition, it has benefits and opportunities in there for our communities. But not only that, there's education, skills training, and adequate social safety systems for priority communities, as C said, as well. Yeah. So the importance of community involvement in the transition to net zero. We need our communities to do this. We need to know who they are. It's really important. And I think that that's the piece here, is that we might be a big organization, but it means nothing if we don't know who the people are that we serve. We're really lucky as an EDB that we are community owned, that they are our major stakeholders, and that we need to ensure that when we look at this transition, as I said before, nobody gets left behind. And I also want to say that we don't have the answers to this. I want to be very clear about that. As an organization, we are learning from our communities because they have localized solutions that we may not be able to, that we may not understand at this point. And that's the important part, is that we learn with and alongside our communities so that we can better understand what their needs are. Oh, shucks. Now I have to stop. So, all right, well, we'll finish off my presentation there. I hope that was enough. But yeah, ka wai, kia ora.
Correct. I want to let you keep talking. Thank you so much, Hinerangi. I think Orion is worth plugging. You're doing some amazing mahi, and refreshing to see such a forward-thinking EDB. Can we have one question? One question. Right at the back, Janet.
Hinerangi, I'm sure you were going to tell us a story about a community you were working with. So can you give us an example? That would be wonderful to hear.
Yeah, sure. So there is a community. So they came out